The turn of the 20th century was more than just an industrial revolution. It was a metabolic revolution. So around 1863, a woman named Ellen White supposedly had these visions or messages from God that told her that she needed to be a vegetarian. And this started a movement that led to the Kellogg Company. So Kellogg's invented their granola cereal. And in the late 1800s, about 1894, they developed cornflakes. Cornflakes were the first processed food ever invented. Then you had Crisco, which came out in 1911. Now, during this span and leading all the way up to the present day, a lot of processed foods began to be developed. Prior to the 1900s, people just ate what they ate. They knew what to eat. They didn't even know about vitamins yet, or nutrition, or calories, or any of that stuff. But yet they were fairly healthy. The first case of coronary heart disease wasn't until 1925. In 1950, there were like 300 cardiologists nationwide. Now there's 3,000, 5,000, a lot. But when you look at our current state of health in this country, I think it comes down to three things that transpired during this time frame. So you had the introduction of processed foods, things like condiments that didn't exist, cereals that didn't exist. And even prior to the 1900s, sugar was expensive and not many people had it. The most they would have would either be maple syrup or honey. But once they figured out a way to process sugar cane, it became a commodity that was fairly cheap. So, number one, you have sugar that's now readily available to everyone at a low cost. You had the seed oils, which were now being eaten. And you also had wheat that was being highly processed. And over the course of about, 50, 60 years, has been crossbred into what we now have, which is something that would never have occurred in nature. And we haven't evolved to process the proteins in those wheats. You had things like Rice Krispies, which was just basically puffed rice. Kellogg's figured out how to do that. You have, things like shredded wheat. You have your highly processed hamburger buns, hot dog buns, breads. Prior to probably the 1970s, maybe even a little earlier than that, your bread was made by a local baker. It wasn't shelf stable enough to be sent around the country. You didn't have an expiration date on bread that would last 2 or 3 months. It might last 2 weeks, and then it had to be thrown out because it would grow mold. So you look at, technology, and we like to think it has advanced the human race, but in some ways it has retarded it, because when you introduce new technologies, they always try to apply it to agriculture and to our food supply, and that has a detrimental effect. So, I really look at those three things as the biggest detriment to our health, by giving us foodstuffs that we were never intended to eat, or not intended to eat in the vast quantities that we have them. So I was at the grocery store yesterday, and I was looking for a beverage that was based with erythritol, and just something that I could have occasionally. And I saw this tea. Now I was in a supposedly health food store, and I pick up this bottle of tea, which was about probably a 12-ounce bottle, and I turned it over to look at the carb content and the sugar content, and this bottle had 68 grams of sugar. To me, I don't know how it wasn't syrup. It just blows my mind that you would put something like that into a health food store. That is just absolutely ridiculous. There needs to be some sort of regulation to limit how much sugar they can put in these foods and beverages. I know New York tried to do a thing with banning, the supersized sodas and all that, and they may have passed it. I don't know. I don't live in New York. But I don't think limiting the size of it is really the issue. I think the issue is limiting the amount of sugar in it. I think getting rid of high fructose corn syrup needs to be done. Our wheat needs to go back to the einkorn wheat, which is the wheat that we would have eaten for 10,000 years, not some hybrid of a Japanese and American wheat that would have never crossbred in the wild because they're too far apart. They couldn't have pollinated each other. So how do we go about fixing all this? And at this point in time, you still have people who are following this Seventh-day Adventist type of eating that didn't exist prior to Ellen White and her so-called visions. So, a lot of people don't know the history of diet and nutrition. They don't know the history of how things transpired and how people conspired to get our food system the way it is. The first person in charge of the American Diabetic Association or Dietetics Association was a Seventh-day Adventist. What do you think her recommendations for diet and nutrition would have been? And they've been following that ever since. Kellogg's. I mean, there are a number of them out there who have followed this line of thinking and their belief system and have forced it on the rest of the American public. And unfortunately, it's kind of like a cult. You really have to get people when they're young and get them brainwashed into believing this way of eating because, most people don't do the research. They just believe whatever they're told. Oh, well, the government says this, so that's the way we should do it. And the American Heart Association says do this, so we'll do it. They don't go back and look at what we did historically. How did we eat prior to this whole metabolic revolution that happened at the turn of the 20th century? How did we eat before we had ketchup and mayonnaise and mustard and, all these sodas that didn't exist prior to then, prior to the 20th century and some of our health regulations that have come about, and with good reason. Most people drank beer or whiskey or wine because it was safer than the water. The other thing that happened during the Industrial Revolution was we switched from an agricultural society to a manufacturing society. People left the farms to go get jobs in factories because they could make more money that way. But that came at a price. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the biggest meal of the day was lunch. You would stop and have a full-blown, what we would now consider dinner, at lunchtime. And then dinner was whatever leftovers were available after you ate your big midday meal. But when the factory jobs came around, you couldn't have that meal anymore. So you had to bring something to eat for lunch, and dinner was shifted, that huge meal was shifted to dinner time or supper. And that fundamentally changed things because now you're eating a high caloric meal just hours before you go into bed. So your body hasn't even had time to process that food yet. Where prior to that, when we ate that meal midday, we did have time to burn that off. So I think there's been a number of factors that have contributed to this mess that we're in currently. And I really wish people would do their homework and do their research and use common sense to go, hey, prior to the turn of the 20th century, we didn't have all this stuff. So that begs the question, what did we eat before then? And it was simple. It was meat and very few vegetables, mainly because we didn't have refrigeration. You couldn't get vegetables all year long. You get meat all year long, fish, things like that. So I don't think the carnivore diet necessarily is a new revolution. I think it's a rediscovered revolution. I think it's been rediscovered over and over again Since probably the 1700s. If I remember correctly, there was a diet that was prescribed for someone wealthy back in the mid-1700s that was a carnivore diet. And even a ketogenic diet was prescribed in the early 1900s because of the health benefits for people with epilepsy. It reduced their seizures. So really, we like to think how advanced we are, but when it comes to nutrition, we've retarded ourselves. We've gone backwards, and now we're suffering as a result. Hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe, make a comment. Let me know what you think. Have a great day.